I'm Caradina Sale with the Community Technical Assistance Center at the NYU Silver School of Social Work's McSilver Institute. And today's webinar is called Treating Youth Fire Setting Behavior. Every year in the United States, hundreds of people die, thousands are injured, and millions of dollars are lost in direct property damage from children's misuse of fire. Fortunately, many youth who are setting fires are not seriously injured and are primarily motivated by curiosity. Well-targeted education programs conducted by trained fire prevention personnel are really effective in intervening with this dangerous behavior. However, there is a part of the percentage of the young people who are driven by motivations other than curiosity and require intervention beyond education. The mental health community plays a critical role in effectively assessing and treating this behavior. That's you all. And yet, many professionals have not received any formal training or information regarding youth fire setting behavior. Chat in if you have received any formal training. The aim of today's training is both to increase awareness about the extent of the problem and identify assessment and treatment protocols that can be helpful in both intervention and prevention. Today's presentation is presented by Paul Schwartzman, who is a licensed mental health counselor providing counseling services to children, adolescents, and families in the Rochester area for more than 40 years. He's a real leader in the field, and his interest of youth fire setting developed while on staff at the University of Rochester, where he participated with other researchers in the study of youth fire play and fire setting. Paul was a member of the original research team that originated the fire-related youth unit for the City of Rochester, New York Fire Department and the BIC preschool fire safety education curriculum, both award-winning programs that address issues of children and fire. Paul is a past chair of the board of directors of the National Fire Protection Association Education Section and was a co-chairperson of the NFPA Youth Fire Setter Intervention Committee. Paul is also the executive director of the Finger Lakes Regional Burn Association. He currently maintains a private consulting and counseling practice in Fairport, New York. We're really lucky to have Paul with us today. So thank you, Paul, for sharing your expertise with us.
All right, I think that means me, right? So again, let me add my welcome and excitement to being here this afternoon, and thanks to Kara and NYU and the Office of Mental Health for making this happen. I think Kara gave a pretty good introduction to some of my background. I might add to it for a second or two, but I just want to share my excitement about this. You heard that I've been doing this for a long time. As you heard, I started my career at the University of Rochester in the Department of Psychiatry over 40 years ago, which is hard to say out loud, but it is my reality, and it's become a life-altering and an area of passion and something I've worked in for a long time. Quite honestly, came to it by accident. I did my actually I started my undergraduate work at NYU, so I was in New York City for a bit, then moved back upstate to Rochester to finished my undergraduate degree in developmental psychology at the University of Rochester, went on the graduate school at the University of Rochester, and then went to work for the University of Rochester in the Department of Psychiatry. My area of interest was high-risk children and families. So that's kind of what got me into this. And because of some of the early research and exposure in the Rochester area, literally got a knock on our door at the Department of Psychiatry one day with this guy who walked in with bagels and coffee. Turns out he's an arson investigator from the City of Rochester Fire Department, and he's concerned about youth involved in fire misuse. And he said, "We need you to fix them." And this was in the early 80s. I knew nothing and really had very limited exposure to this. We looked at each other and said, "We can't help you." But we were young upstarts in a big research setting, and so the rule of thumb was publish or perish, get your grant money. And his name was Jerry Bills. He was an arson investigator and said the magic words, "I think I can get you a grant." And I said, "Keep talking." And he did. He got us a federal grant to do a broad-based, community-based study of children in fire. Proud to say that became landmark research and literally changed my life. It set me on a unique path that I never would have predicted that I would have become involved in. we did put together a intervention program for the City of Rochester Fire Department, which was then replicated throughout the county, developed intervention and prevention protocols, which proud to say have now been replicated around the world and kind of set me up as a unique path to be a supposed expert in this field. I take some pride in saying that after 40 years, I get some bragging rights, but we're still learning. So my hope this afternoon is to orient all of you to, what's withstood the test of time and experience, and kind of orient you to this. I'm trying to kind of keep an eye on the chat and the screen at the same time, and Kara's gonna, kind of shout at me if I miss something. I know she made a mention before, if, making a comment that if you've had some prior training. So, I also want to reiterate, I'm excited about this session particularly because I've been doing this a long time. And in the more recent history, the real mission has been to bring mental health professionals into this field, which historically we've been very absent from, and we've been the weak link. I know even from my own early education and graduate school education, and even early professional development in the field, there was never anything involving, youth and fire, maybe some very small exposure to pyromania as we looked at the DSM. But that was it. And that was, pretty scary. And so most of us in the field said, well, I don't work with that. And I don't want to. That's not going to be my area of emphasis. So we tended to kind of move away from it and feel a little bit unsettled by it, frightened by it, too much responsibility in it. But the good news is that that's not true. We really have a unique power to intervene with this and to be effective, and we are critical players in the arena. And we'll talk about that more as the afternoon goes on. So for me to have this many mental health people, kind of in the arena at the same time, I think it's a record. I've been doing, mental health treatment training for, youth and fire for a long time. And normally I have 20 mental health professionals, and then I have firefighters, social service people, law enforcement people. It's always a mix of blend of people who have some vested interest in this field. So I'm excited to have a much larger crew here and hopefully create our understanding and our confidence. So thanks for being here. My hope is to do the following, and I think, we already went over the agenda, but I'm going to try to describe to you is who are these kids and why are they doing it? How can we be more confident in evaluating and assessing so that we are more confident that we got what we got, and that becomes prescriptive information in terms of then what are we going to do about it and what are some of the more effective interventions. So that's our agenda for the next now a little less than 2 hours. I'm going to talk somewhat fast because my anxiety right now is covering a lot of information in 2 hours. I normally have the privilege of doing this maybe over the course of a day. So I'm going to do my best to give you a meaningful overview and some depth so that you hopefully can leave here at 2 o'clock with, maybe a little more than you came in with. And I always offer myself after today, you'll have my contact information. So if I can answer questions or help troubleshoot down the road, hopefully you're going to see that this is my commitment, my passion, and it's and I'm here in any way I can be. So Kara did give you some initial statistics, and I don't want to spend a whole lot of time about them, but just to give you some other quick overview of just how big is this problem. There's good news here, in many ways, that when I started in this industry back in the early 80s, we were looking at a few 100,000 fires a year. And you can see then by looking at the numbers on the screen right now, we've come way down from that, and clearly still too many, but it's good news. And some of that has been because we've been effective in a number of ways. The educational interventions that Kara mentioned as part of the early interventions are very effective. We have very low recidivism rates when those things are done well and comprehensively. When the mental health and the other systems come into play and do our job and do it effectively, we're also very good at reducing subsequent behaviors. there have been some artifacts in the world that I think have also helped us along. In the early days, the percentages of smokers was much, much higher. So therefore, the ready access to matches, lighters in the environment was certainly more present. That's changed. I think that's helped the cause. Uh, we've there's other fads that have come along that I think have challenged us a little bit. Candles, and now I think the more current one, which we'll talk about very briefly, but bonfires and fire pits is the new craze. But and so what I'm going to tell you is the problem is still very relevant. The other bad news about this screen is I'm going to tell you I am very confident that these numbers are very underreported and very underestimated. This issue is kind of ebbed and flowed over the decades. It runs like it's faddish. There's times when we have lots of federal funding. There are good comprehensive programs that develop over the course of the country with good community communication and task force to maintain the problem, keep it in the public eye, and then we're very effective. And then a new thing comes along, or funding gets challenged, or personnel changes, and the person who led the program with some passion moves on, somebody new comes in. And right now, I think we're kind of, again, in a little bit of on a downward spiral and trying to get that boulder back up the hill. So my hope is you're all going to help with that. But nevertheless, it remains a serious issue and one that requires and deserves attention. So let's kind of move through. And what I want to do for this first section is try to establish a baseline. Who are these kids? What do they look like? Where's our role and where isn't our role? So if we look at this systematically over time, from the 50,000 foot level, and do it comprehensively, the good news is the majority of children who engage in fire misuse are what we refer to as non-pathological. And I'm going to throw around some terms here that sometimes are controversial. We've been debating them for years. So for a long time, what we talked about was these non-pathological kids is children who are involved in curiosity, fire misuse, or fire play. People poke at that. There was a phase where people got upset about fire play because play is a normal developmental child behavior. We don't want to couple fire and play together. And so again, I'm going to use these terms as they've been typically used and defined just for our discussion this afternoon. But please be mindful of where we go. I'll talk about fire setting or fire settings. That's the more pathological end of this. And really what we're talking about is trying to understand motivation and intention. So in the curiosity, it's learning, it's curiosity, it's experimentation. In the more pathological, there typically is more intentional use of fire. And that's what we want to be able to determine is looking at those things. One other comment about the slide is there also is some discussion in more current research or numbers that the pathological piece of this pie is growing a little bit. And that may be true due to the more complexity of our world. We know I did a presentation a couple of years ago at a national fire misuse conference, and the talk was, did the pandemic make us crazier? And in some ways, I think that it did. I think there's data that suggests that's true. So there are higher levels of stress, higher levels of diagnoses. And so I think we did see some kind of blip up. I think the other thing is because the mental health community is so challenged and the demand is so great that access is more difficult. So I think there is sometimes this delay in getting to early interventions or services. So sometimes maybe by the time we see certain youth that there probably maybe some more complexity in terms of what they're presenting. So, it's just kind of learning about this. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but one thing I do want to alert people to, and this, the other thing about this beginning part of this discussion is all of this hopefully is your kind of this checklist in the back of your mind as you choose to get involved in this arena in terms of how do we know we got what we got? And what's typical and what's atypical. And one of the things we learned over time is that this is a behavior typically of younger children. I think very often when we think about fire setting, fire misuse, arson, whatever terms that, we hear in the culture. Our media association, or at least typically in the public, is to go to the older teenagers, the 16, 17, 18-year-olds who are, tough acting out kids and, troublemakers. And the fact is that that really is not who's engaged in this behavior. The majority are actually quite young. It tends to be a bimodal curve, with the majority being, between that kind of 6, 7 to 9, 10, and then maybe a little bit of a lull, and then a blip up in middle school, and then it falls off again. And so we'll look at some of that. What you see on this graph is, is the long-term collection of the Rochester region data. It's the national data from National Fire Protection Association. And then we also have another national database called Why Fires, which is more recent and fairly national. You'll see there, those are the gray bars, if that's gray on your screens. You do see a little higher, blip up in the older kids there. And I think that's partly because of the last comment I made, is that how kids are coming to our attention and to the fire services, some change in how systematic programs are being run around the country right now. So continuing on to the theme, what I want to do is set up a baseline for you. And so who are these kids? Why are they doing it? How am I going to determine whether a referral or somebody comes into my agency is appropriate for this agency? Do they need, my help or your help as a mental health professional? Or, is that educational intervention I talked about sufficient? So let's start, and I see this behavior on a continuum. So here's the baseline, here's the foundation. So curiosity, as I mentioned, fire play, we'll call it that for our discussion this afternoon. Fire misuse, fire experimentation, you can decide what you're comfortable with. But through long-term data collection and also through some fairly systematic developmental studies, some done here in Rochester by myself and my colleagues, replicated in Oregon and in Massachusetts, one of the things that we do know is that about 40 to 50% of all kids will experiment with fire at some point in their career as kids. Many of those will never know about. Me included. My own story when I was 9 years old, that I scared myself because something bad almost happened, and I decided this wasn't a good idea, and I never got caught, and nobody ever knew. I know there's lots and lots of youth in this country that match that. But some of those will come to the attention of the professionals or the fire service. So it's a fairly broad base of kids. So what's the formula that encourages that? I think most of us find fire a pretty incredible, amazing substance. It really is incredible, fascinating, curious, and soothing and interesting and engaging. And I know, I love a good fire pit myself, but so what flips that kid from that, they're going to do it or they're not going to do it? So one of the things we know in this formula is that these kids tend to be, and I chose the word mischievous here. They're not necessarily troublemakers or bad kids, but these are the kids that are going to tend to be more risk takers. They're the ones going to go for it. These are the ones many of you may know in your own families and your own children, that when they were 2 or 3, they were starting to play with the the electric socket on the wall, and you're going, no, don't touch, hot danger, hand danger. And they kind of stop and they look at you with that little smile as they continue on their journey. So this is the kids not necessarily going to take our word for or a no, or be careful. They're going to kind of continue to go. The other thing we've kind of learned, and this continues perhaps throughout the continuum, is that these are children that have a real false sense of control. They really, and some of this is developmental. They really have a poor understanding of fire. And the majority of children, even older children, really don't understand the power of fire, the speed of fire. Even many adults don't truly understand. And mainly because they have limited exposure or haven't experienced things. And again, Hollywood gives us some misrepresentation. So there is this kind of foundational misunderstanding. The other thing that we found in the developmental studies when we looked at kids is that there was how fire was used or modeled in a household. And we're going to talk about that in some more depth later. But as we do the assessments, I'm going to kind of hold a story for that. And the other thing we find is that parents will often give what we've called a premature assignment of responsibility. So that's allowing kids who are younger, who really don't have an understanding or the maturation or development level to really understand what the responsibility is and what they're doing, but they're allowed to do it. So they feel empowered. Mom or dad think this is okay. They let me do this. They let me make breakfast or cook when I'm 6 or 7. And so there's the sense of empowerment there. So all of these things kind of go into building some sense of learning and maybe some permission to then grow with this behavior, as I think will become apparent. The last two things we'll talk about is access and supervision. And here I don't mean neglect. We'll talk about that in a little bit as well. Here, what I mean is this normal everything, I guess to give you an example, personal example, when I was young, I was 9, I experimented with matches. My dad was in the clothing industry. His business card was a matchbook. It has his name and address. Well, they were all over my house. I mean, I could close my eyes and reach out to the coffee table and pick up a pack of matches. They were readily available in the environment. Where we find a lot of fire misuse in the environments and look at it more closely, it may not be as blatant as that, but even if the parents are thoughtful about it, they put them in the kitchen junk drawer or somewhere where they're available and that kids know how to discover them. And here we're talking about momentary lapses in supervision. They're up in their bedroom playing where they normally might be. They might be in the basement or in the family room. It's these things where it's a couple of minutes of lack of supervision. And this slide, this is the formula for still thousands of fires in this country still to this day. So here's our foundation of kind of what lays this exposure and interest and vulnerability with fire. So I'm hoping that makes sense here. And as we did say, if there are questions or thoughts you have as this goes along, or I'm not being clear, or you need some clarification, please let us know. So I want to move on. So how do we go to that next category, with those ones that are beyond curiosity? And when is it that our role becomes more apparent? So what this slide depicts is the categories of what we'll call pathological or problem fire setting or trouble fire setting behaviors. And I'm trying to list these in somewhat of their prevalence. And there may be a little variability here, but for the first two, we're going to see the majority beyond curiosity, what we refer to in the literature. And again, you're going to find some different terms here, and different presenters, different researchers, different programs might come up with some, slightly different words here, but we're talking about the same things. So I'm going to explain these a little bit more in a moment. So cry for help being the most prevalent, delinquent, probably following from there. The psychopathological, meaning more profound mental health diagnoses. The cognitively impaired being, more developmentally impaired, neurologically impaired, and then lastly, what we call social culture. So let me start to kind of lay some groundwork for who and what those kids are and what those look like. And the purpose of this will blend into the treatment strategies and philosophy, because knowing what we got and doing careful evaluation really becomes prescriptive, and then defines what are the systems and the approaches that we want to then emphasize. So the cry for help, again, always a little defensive about, family dysfunction. I know that term's getting a little dated, but I'm dated, so, forgive me. But, here we're talking about people with, more emotionally motivated, fire misuse or fire setting behaviors. Approximately 20% goes across the age span, and the risk factor here is that these are often become more multiple or progressive, fire misuse, and often stem from more chronic family dynamics and family systems presentations. Let me make a quick comment here about the all ages. You saw that slide of ages before. You heard me make the comment about, this is a behavior of primarily younger children. So the curiosity does tend to be made up of the majority of younger children, typically under the age of 10, if you were to really graphic more carefully. Now, that doesn't mean that if we have a kid who's 15, that he's not primarily motivated out of curiosity. So we need to be mindful of that distinction. I've certainly had plenty of kids who I call my budding scientists, who are using fire to, experiment, and then things go wrong, but they're not, motivated out of, other more, implicit dynamics in their households. So let me go on to define this in a couple different ways. So this next slide, I know when Kara and I were putting today together, I presented her with this presentation and this slide, and she had some questions. Does this go here, and why is that there, and what is this stuff? And I promised her that it would be in context pretty quickly. So what you see in front of you is the literal, definition of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, from the DSM manual. And these are the prerequisites in order to diagnose, both from an inattention standpoint and from a high hyperactivity or impulsivity standpoint. So why is this important? One of the things we know from long-term research is that children and adolescents who are diagnosed or even not diagnosed or who suffer from ADHD are more highly represented in this population. So and for me, there are two aspects of this that I think as mental health professionals and doing evaluations and treatment protocols, we want to be mindful of it. One is it doesn't automatically, and again, they have their own challenges, and we clearly understand that. But from a standpoint of fire misuse, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are a problem, fire misuser. When we talk about impulsivity, we understand that that's what that is. I have a dear friend and colleague from the Northwest, psychologist by the name of Linda Nisi-Stradner. She's one of my good colleagues who's also very immersed in the fire misuse behavior as a therapist in her own right, but also an expert in ADHD. And she does some training on this that I think is great. And one of her workshops is called Ready, Fire, Aim. And so there's this notion of we often will, act before think. So, you saw my formula for momentary lapses of vision, ready access to materials, misunderstanding, and now we add impulsivity into that formula. And so the kids walking through the kitchen and there's the lighter or the pack of matches or the, fireplace, matchsticks or whatever they are. And there's that immediate, ooh, and then there is that curiosity, impulsivity, and we have an action. Certainly, is that a high risk behavior? Yes, but it's not necessarily indicative of a more severe mental health dynamic. But ADHD can also go untreated, undiagnosed. And so the other place where I see this as being more consequential is, let's say it isn't something that's effectively intervened, and we have a younger person maybe that, say with that 8, 9-year-old time frame, and they are ADHD and they're going to school and they're in school and they're, it's now what, Thanksgiving, coming up on Thanksgiving week. So they've been there since September, and there's their desk. And if you open their desk, there's every piece of paper and thing they've collected and played with and books and, assignments have been returned, and they open their desk and the teacher goes, take your math book out and open the page 43, and they open up their desk and they're rumbling through and papers are falling out, and and finally they find their math book and they bring it out and put it on the table, and then they lean over to their neighbor, what page are we supposed to be on, because they missed that because of inattention and all the reasons we understand. And all of a sudden, the teacher's on and it's Matthew. How many times have I told you, if you've got a question, you raise your hand, and now he's a disappointment, and this is going to go on a few more times through the day, and then eventually the day ends, and he gets home, and he runs home and runs into the house, and there's mom after a full day of school. Hey, honey, welcome home. How was your day? And he immediately goes, great, because he's not going to talk about it. And comes into the kitchen and says, I made some cookies, and oh, great. Oh, and then she looks down and sees, he's got his shoes on, and, and the rules, when you come into the house after school, you got to take your shoes off. Okay, sorry, I forgot, because we always forget with ADHD. inherent into the disorder. And he goes marching back through the family room, and the TV's on, and here we are, impulsivity, distractibility, and then we turn our attention to the TV screen, and it's, ooh, I love this show. And there he is. And mom, who's, endearing and loving, comes back into the family room with the cookies and immediately looks down. Didn't I just tell you to take your shoes off? Oh, I forgot. What do you mean you forgot? I told you 3 times. And then once again, I'm a disappointment, I'm in trouble. And now we magnify that every day, all day. So now we're setting up a new dynamic in terms of family dynamic, parenting, the sense of competence, self-esteem. And so you'll see in a few moments where this then might now become a motivator for some more acting out or for some other firearms use. So, I think, there's different ways and why the ADHD shows up more in this population that we need to be mindful of. I hope that's clear. So I'll move on from there. So the cry for help. This slide is really very pertinent. One of the best predictors of repeat fire setting is the documented presence of physical and sexual abuse and chronic neglect. What you see here is the slide where there's a history of chronic neglect, and the percentage on the far right there is the percentage of recidivism. So if there's a history, if it's a yes for chronic neglect, we have a 11.4% rate of recidivism. If no, it's 2.3. So over a 5-fold increase in the likelihood of repeat fire setting. Down below is the history of involvement with law. Now there is the history of involvement with law with any family member. This could be a parent. And what this, tries to speak to is the disorganization and chaos in the family, and where that also now becomes a dynamic that can then begin to explain this behavior. So yeah, I mentioned that this can be now kind of a multiple progressive behavior. I'll give you, I think, a quick story to make this real. This was also a case of ours here in Rochester. He was 9 or 10, and he went to this after-school program that was attached to his elementary school. I know we had some folks in here from Rochester, so this all happened at school number 9 in the city of Rochester, and attached to that is a community center and an after-school program. So one day after school, one of the supervisors or after-school program people goes into the little kitchenette and notices that there's a pot holder on the burner of the stove starting to smolder. Immediately grabs it, throws it in the sink, and oh my gosh, which one of us, might have, done that, or gosh, how stupid, let people know, and everybody acknowledged it, but we weren't clear where it came from. But it was noted. About a day or two later, we had a small fire in a trash can in the building. A couple of days later, we had a fire in the dumpster behind the building. So you're seeing that these things are getting a little bit more risk-taking, a little bit larger. Within another week, we had a multiple alarm fire in school 9, in the elementary school building itself. Fire service responds, arson investigation gets going full time, trying to understand what this is. They can see that they are intentionally set, they're incendiary fires. Starting asking lots of questions. They talked to the people at the daycare. They did learn about the potholder, the trash can, the dumpster. We're seeing the progression of this. Still not clear, but very, given our experience, we pretty confident that we have a young person involved here. So the arson investigator had a brilliant idea. He talked to the teachers. They were able to do a pass system and look at people who were out of the classroom at specific times. The arson investigation were able to pin down where and when the fire started. So they targeted a few specific classrooms, and they had the idea. They have the kids write an essay of how do they think this fire started. And one little boy wrote, "I think this fire started because a little boy was being tied to his bed and beaten." Not making this stuff up. And lo and behold, there was our person. When we began to chat with him, initially there was some annoyance and, what were you thinking? What were you doing? He was somewhat remorseful, but was able, so with remorse and with perceived understanding, remember I said, real misunderstanding of fire. Well, no, that's why I started the fire downstairs when everybody else was upstairs. So in his mind, he's being thoughtful. And he did finish his story with, I figured if I did something bad enough, you'd get me the hell out of there. He didn't use the word hell, but so there was a sort of a strategic nature, an intentional nature. So it was literally a cry for help in the truest sense of that term. So this is something we're going to be incredibly mindful, all of you. Well, I'm sure some of these are things you've already been aware of. I'm going to talk later about the collaboration with agencies and the importance of that. And this is where our colleagues and child protectives and social services become really important and imperative in this process and remaining involved. So I'll move on from there. Just to give you a little bit more kind of substance of this in terms of the dynamic and the seriousness of this. Cornell Abraxas Youth Fire Center Intervention Program profile. This is actually a residential treatment facility. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's located in Pennsylvania, not very far from Emmitsburg, Maryland, or Emmitsburg or Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. It's a well-known program in the youth fire misuse industry. And one of the few, kind of structured residential treatment programs. For your awareness, by the way, there is a certification program, not a treatment program per se, but a broad youth fire center intervention certification program that's taught by the National Fire Service at Emmitsburg at the National Fire Academy. It's a full week program. And as part of that program, you actually go on a field trip to Abraxas and actually do some interviews with the residents there and get to talk to them. But what this next couple slides gives you some demographics for the makeup of the youth who end up in this program. And again, not sometimes different than youth that don't end up in this program. So the average number of fires that are documented in this population is 27.6. Average assessment of property damage, we're talking 35,000 average. We know that's probably more in today's inflation in the world. Average age of first fire, you're again that younger child I keep referencing, 9.6 years of age. History of sexual abuse. This is again through intakes and collaboration with other agencies. History of sexual abuse, 38%. History of verbal abuse and humiliation, 76. Physical abuse, 78. Chronic neglect, 100. I don't know of any other study in population where I've seen anything come up with 100%. So these are youth who are coming from some really chronic and long-term kind of complicated and difficult situations. In terms of the assessment and also what's typical, we do know, and this is held up through time, the vast majority of people who present to the fire service and to professionals are 85% boys, 15% female. We know that, but this is who comes to the attention of services at some point. I mentioned the developmental studies that we've conducted over the years. When we look at that from a more developmental level, we ask kids who didn't come to the attention and more anonymous situations, have you ever, misused fire in your career as a kid? And when we talk to girls about that, this more than doubled from this particular slide. So we do know that girls are more highly represented in the population. The difference is also they tend to be smarter about it. They're more careful, they're less risk-taking. Girls tend to misuse fire, boys tend to burn things more. So they are more likely to get discovered or come to our attention. So in terms of your assessments, if you've got a young woman who comes to your attention, I wouldn't minimize it. This next slide, there's more need for research in terms of females, but it's growing and we're getting there. This comes from a study at another treatment protocol in Massachusetts. This was conducted by, I know, a colleague of mine and Kara's gotten to know as well, is Dr. Robert Stodolnik. And so what do we discover about some of the women, young women who come into mental health care or some level of intervention, is they tend to show up later. They tend to be, later in that middle school and young adolescent stage of life. They, you saw that average fires of 26. They may have much fewer, but they're equally as aggressive to their male counterparts, have a more significant history of sexual abuse, victimization, higher rates of substance abuse and mood disorders, highly dysfunctional families with high conflict and pathology or mental illness. And here's an interesting one, but less social skill deficit. So, like I said, girls, when they misuse fire, tend to be smarter about it. I think we also see girls, that's the stereotype to most of us that, boys may tend to be a little later in their development, a little slower, girls a little quicker. I think there is some truth to the sense that girls are a little better when they're younger in terms of their ability to manage social skills and situations. So if they're presenting with the history of all the above, they tend to hide it a little bit better than boys at earlier points of life. But then they get into that early adolescence and more into development and puberty, where then and the boys are the boys. Their vulnerability is more easily triggered, and that vulnerability and those trauma responses become more inflamed, no pun intended, and show up here. So, I think we just want to be attentive to that kind of thing. I wasn't going to talk too much about this in terms of treatment, but I just thought about this. I think I don't even have a slide on it. But, one of our intervention protocols, it can be group interventions. So given this in mind, if we're doing treatment groups, we might want to be thoughtful about segregating, particularly young adolescents or adolescent females and males, and because of some of the history or the safety to be able to explore and talk about some of their experiences differently. So I'm going to keep going with this just to kind of deal with some of the mental health presentations we're likely to see, and then in terms of the motivations and profiles, and then we'll shift gears again. So this is one that shows up quite often. This is, I always struggle with this diagnosis in some ways. I think it's a complicated one, and I think it rarely is ever mutually exclusive from others, and it's harder to factor out, but certainly it presents. So, what do we see here? And there's good news and bad news in this particular diagnosis and slide, because, I'll give you the good news quick. The good news is that fire setting or fire misbehavior or use in this particular population is that very often the fire behavior isn't as entrenched or internalized in these youth than we might see in some of the other presentations. These are kids who are just aggressive towards people and animals, destructive of properties, fire setting. So, if they have a rock, it'll go through a window. If they have a match or a lighter, they'll set a fire. It isn't necessarily a priority. It's more one of convenience. So, and then we're some of the other trigger here in terms of that aggression towards people and animals. One of the things I have seen in many of the younger, adolescents and people that have presented with more conduct disorder and fire misuse is this misinterpreted social cues. And this, become a little accented later, or hopefully you can just kind of keep it in the back of your mind around some of the interventions, particularly around anger management and socialization and communication skills and social management. I had a young man I worked with who was a fighter as well as, involved in fire setting behaviors. And we discovered the fire setting secondary, actually, that what brought him into my practice was fighting behavior. He got long-term suspended from school. And where I was, and so in my intake, and so, I always do a fairly comprehensive intake about risk-taking behaviors. But, and by the way, this is also just a quick prompt here is, even, I don't know what all your practices are, what your exposure to this issue is, or whether you're working with it actively now or not. But, I've worked with a lot of mental health professionals and people in private practice or in agencies who, will say, I don't work with these youth. And my standard answer is, oh, yes, you do. You just don't know that you do. Uh, a lot of the research, indicates that probably upwards of 20% of the youth sitting in front of us at any one point in time have a history of fire misuse, but we don't know it because it's not been identified. And we typically, as mental health professionals, never ask that. And so that's been an ingrained habit of mine through all my intakes. And I'm going to encourage you to do the same, to ask about risk-taking behaviors, and very specifically about use with fire. So back to misinterpretive social cues. He came to my attention because of fight. There was also, the fire setting behavior there, which also was sometimes prompted by other events or triggers in his life. And so I said, well, let's, we started talking about the fight just to try to understand it. And I said, okay, what started that fight? How did it happen? And he looked at me and he said, well, the kid was in my face. And I said, okay, but he was in your face? What, help me with that. What exactly does that mean? What do you do to be in your face? And, or he looked at me. And I said, he looked at you, just that? I mean, with any particular expression or something? No, don't, but I just knew this the way he looked at me that, it was, Duke's up. And I said, okay, let's play with that for a minute. And I was, getting to, kind of develop some rapport with this kid. I think I was getting some level of trust with him, and we're getting along and talking pretty openly. And I said, okay, you and I have known each other now for a couple sessions, a few hours, but we don't know each other well, but we're getting to know each other. Let's say, we're not going to see each other for a couple of weeks because of the holiday, and but it's Black Friday and I'm at the mall and it's, crowded, and, and there's a group of young guys coming at me down the hall, and it's, a little far away, and I'm kind of looking, and I think, wait, that's, that's Fred. I think, I think that's Fred. And I kind of, I don't know what all of you can see of me in the screen right now, but, I kind of give you that kind of curious look, like, I know you. And, and I really kind of just, kind of got my face scrunched up a little bit because I want to go, hey, Fred, hey, hi. I said, if you saw me looking at you like that, would I be in your face? And his first, yeah, yeah. And I go, well, wait a minute. Couldn't it be? We know each other. We haven't seen each other in a few weeks, and I recognize you. And I want to say, hey, hi. And it took me some convincing, to kind of get him to accept so that there could be alternatives here. So, that was, some of the dynamic with, this particular presentation. And you'll see later that we have kind of this kind of, kind of skill building as part of the treatment protocols, and that particularly fits in the specific presentation. So, what else are we likely to see? Adjustment disorder. Again, we know that's kind of one of those catch-all areas there, but it shows up fairly often. In here, we would have case studies of this might be a divorce. This might be a remarriage. This might be the birth of a sibling. And I'm thinking of a particular case right now. I'll throw out very quickly. A young woman. This was a young adolescent female. Parent, mother, divorced family. Birth father out of the picture, not really an issue. She really didn't care, didn't have a relationship with them. Had a good relationship with her mother and stepfather. Good stuff. But some years down the road, mom's pregnant, new baby sibling. New baby shows up, the whole household is now different. Her place in the family, suddenly very different, very displaced. She felt very displaced. And then we had a presentation of a fire in the new baby's bedroom. She presents as the hero because she went into the room and discovered the fire, grabbed the baby, got him outside, and oh my gosh, look what I did. Fire department does respond. And what was typical in our department is that whenever there is an actual fire, usually the investigators will roll and take a look. They talk to the young woman and her description of the fire and what happened and where the fire was. And, oh my gosh, so glad you were there. And man, this could have been tragic. And, and once the fire was out, there was minimal damage. They walked through the room, and lo and behold, she described the fire in the corner near the crib. No, there's no burnt material. There is no fire near the crib. The fire's on the other side of the room. So her description and the actual physical circumstances of the fire don't match up. Pretty experienced investigator, pretty, clued into youth involvement. Kind of challenged her in a sort of way. She broke down pretty quickly. So again, not a chronic, serious fire misbehavior in terms of the practice, clearly could have been a loss of a life, but I think it's a good illustration of some of the things that you're more likely to see. So here's that adjustment disorder, the sense of displacement, family change, depression, I think much more highly represented than we appreciate. We often do find the kids who choose this behavior tend to have lower self-esteem. This comes out of the literature and the research and the long-term evaluations, poor social skills. So why, the million-dollar question, why fire? As I'm talking, I'm sure, there's lots of people with experience and immersed in this field and in different agencies, working with lots of these kids who aren't showing fire misuse and present with this. What's the difference? Well, part of what we understand about, I mentioned that fire and that baseline, but part of what happens here is there's a learning curve. So most of these kids are going to start with some elementary level of experimentation and curiosity. And in that, there's learning. They learn very quickly what the power of fire is, in the attention that it can get so powerfully, whether it be from a parent, from a community, fire, doesn't matter, so even if it's just screwing around and mom and, gets really pissed off and screams, that's attention. That's jerking somebody's chain when you've got an issue. So if we don't have other ways to express ourselves or to manage emotions and don't have the confidence or to do this, fire becomes a more attractive choice and alternative. So, that's why these things become a little bit more interesting in terms of our evaluation, but also in terms of the treatment interventions and skill building. One of the things that really came to light in the more recent history of fire misuse is the whole bullying dynamic. We had a couple of different presentations that we saw here. One was the bullies use fire to victimize a young woman in school. They attempted to burn her hair and her things. So the fire was actually an acting out behavior and a bullying behavior. On the other side of that coin, we had a young man who was victimized and ultimately started the bully's house, the siding on the bully's house on fire. So that's something, again, we kind of have brought into this arena and become much more mindful of. In terms of diagnosis or other things, post-traumatic stress disorder, the whole area of trauma, I think also, a much more rising need of awareness in terms of trauma these years. I think it's somewhat obvious when we talk about, the chronic neglect, physical, sexual abuse, and, those as young children, and where that becomes a more prolonged exposure, we've all, I think, become much more mindful of trauma and these dynamics. But again, I think we need to elevate it in terms of what its association and correlations are to fire misuse. Quick comment on more severe pathology. It happens. We do find early indications of more psychotic presentations. I've been doing this now for a few decades. I have a couple of very close friends who are my colleagues around the country. We talk together fairly often. We can, between us can count on two hands the number of times that we've really seen this, but it's there. I have personally seen a presentation with again, an elementary school age young man who did set his baby brother on fire. Fortunately, discovered quickly, no profound injury. But in the intake and the evaluation, we, would ask him about, what was his thinking and what was he, looking to do and why did this happen? And he said in matter-of-factly that the devil told him to do that. And so I would ask, well, how do you talk to the devil? Well, and he, with all seriousness, said he's sitting in the chair next to you. Again, I've been doing this a long time. I'm fairly exposed, but literally the hair on the back of my neck, stood up and chills ran down my back. And this was, oh my God, this is a true delusional state, a true psychotic state. This was happening. This kid was, hospitalized and then subsequently treated. But so it's going to present, but unfortunately, I think through the history and through misinformation, this kind of thing has been overpresented and kind of highlighted as, again, I don't want to be political here, but very much like we're seeing in our news trends today about, the dangers of transgender, boys in our female sports. Again, I hope I'm not going to be controversial there, but, all of a sudden it becomes to too many people a real threat and then gets highlighted and a high level of concern. I just want to emphasize that it's there. We need to be mindful. We need to pay attention. But it's still, you might go the next 20 years of your career and not see it. Let's look on the other side of this coin, just to kind of finish up this area. What about, we've been focused on the youth presentation. What are we most likely to see in them? Well, we're also talking about how this is systemic. This is a family dynamic very often, and is an interaction. So we do see much higher levels of more chronic depression in a parent or parents, as the case may be. And I mentioned that I started my career as a background with high risk children and families. I was involved with a long-term longitudinal study at the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Rochester, looking at children of parents with chronic mental illness that required a hospitalization. And we had enough parents in the study that we could look across the spectrum by diagnosis. So we did comparisons actually of children who grew up in families with chronic, severe depression versus schizophrenia. What we saw was that the youth of chronic depressed parents actually did more poorly than the children of schizophrenic parents. Not that either was wonderful, but they actually did present with some better presentations and resiliency. And what we learned was that with schizophrenics, the parent, they would see the parent talking to Martians on the radio. They had the wherewithal. That was frightening, that was unsettling, but they could then kind of step back from it and go, mom or dad, that's crazy. There's really something wrong there. And often there were other supports, grandparents, other key supports. So, providers that intervene and provide support, that there could be some protection and resilience around that. But with the more chronic depression, it was more insidious. It was less obvious. It was their mom was, if it was mom, she was much more chronically disengaged. So it was this everyday kind of thing with, mom, it's hungry breakfast, get up now. And mom, no, honey, mommy doesn't feel good. I'm gonna stay in bed a little while. You get yourself some cereal. And then a little while, mom, come downstairs, play with me. No, mom still doesn't feel well. And go, watch a video or something. No, but it's this chronic rejection and chronic lack of engagement. And unfortunately, then that becomes internalized. That's the mom doesn't want to be with me. So we'll see some of those evolutions through the time when we're looking at some of these chronic family presentations. And then again, attention-seeking behaviors to bring attention, alcohol, substance abuse, chronic, marital discord, conflict, fighting, arguing domestic violence, poor supervision and monitoring here in a neglectful sense, very mixed messaging in terms of parenting. One thing, it's okay, you get permission to do something one day, and the next day you're getting beaten. Not very expressive in terms of affection. You don't hear "I love you." And as we mentioned earlier, in terms of that, involvement with law, kind of chronic stress, chaos, lack of predictability, and stability. So those are all the things we're, again, I know most of you are probably familiar with, but bringing the correlation to the specific fire misuse and behavior. This is rare, but it's been popping up more specifically in the last couple of years. We've laid the social cultural. This is one organization that's out there. I'll bring attention to one or two others. The Earth Liberation Front is actually an adult organization. You may have heard of it. It shows up on the news on occasion. And this is a group that is, they're extreme environmentalists who are very upset with how we're destroying the planet. And they're using fire and arson to bring attention. They're the threatening wildlife regions. This was happening in the Northwest, where there were all these McMansions being built, outside of Seattle, and all of a sudden they were getting, burned, because that was their statement to stop infringing on the wildlife. The ski resorts in Colorado, they were infringing on wildlife. And then this is from the front page of the Los Angeles Times not too long ago, where a Hummer was set afire to make a statement of the gas guzzlers. I just saw they came out with an electric one now. So, we'll see this, and why this is relevant is they will engage, older adolescents who are wannabe, hippies or activists to do their bidding or to get them involved. We are also seeing some cases with adolescents who just on their own are becoming, more involved in political or cultural causes, and especially, in the last few years. We had a situation, it wasn't mine, I was consultant on it, where a young man, a high school age, younger adolescent, set fire to a copier room. And it was his statement of, damaging the trees and paper misuse, and, really thought he was making a political statement. He was arrested and ultimately, was involved in some interventions. The funny part of this was, I was consulting with the whole team that intervened here, including the police officer who arrested him, just quote unquote, was, did the kid know how much paper I was going to use writing the report on this fire? So it was a unique kind of moment of humor. But again, we want to be mindful of these in terms of, understanding where, youth are being motivated and what's being modeled for them. So that kind of begins, or I'm going to kind of flip back there for a second, and gives you, my hope, some sense of who are these kids and why are they doing it. So you're seeing some of the motivations, some of their, acting out behaviors to bring attention to untenable situations. My hope is that's clear and making sense. I haven't been alerted to any particular questions.
You have. You may have missed it.
I'm sorry. I'm looking at my chat, but I'm not seeing them. Sorry.
No worries. I just want a great question came in about reactive attachment disorder as a factor.
Yes. I mean, again, here, well, we've been talking about the, chronic neglect, trauma, PTSD. It's a great question. And here again, the research is minimal. I have been involved in consultations. One of my unique areas is, because a lot of my life has been involved with high-risk children and families. I'm on a retainer right now to this moment. I do a lot of work with foster care and adoption families in Monroe and particularly our surrounding counties here, Ontario and Seneca counties. I actually am on retainer in Ontario counties. I do a lot of foster and adopting parent support and some work with biological families. So we, clearly we do see higher rates of fire misuse and behavior in that population than we might otherwise. I know that unfortunately there gets to be a stereotype and a fear in that population as well, but it's, again, it's the majority don't, but it does present. And I think that pertains to very much the issues of it's interesting because the whole attachment disorder field has been it's not been controversial, but there's been a lot of discussion about it, and I've been involved in some things actually with Bessel van der Kolk, who most of you probably are aware of because he's the inventor of post-traumatic stress disorder, really. And over the last several years, he's been lobbying for a new diagnosis in the DSM, which hasn't gotten to the threshold yet. I personally think it should be there because his theory is that better explains a lot of the behaviors we see with, attachment disorder. And he wanted to call it, what was it, developmental, I'm forgetting this title right now, developmental stress disorder, but it was basically youth from birth through the first 48 months of life who have been involved in, neglect, rejection, abandonment kind of dynamics. So I'm not sure if that answers the question specifically, but yes, we are seeing correlation. Does that answer the question? Was there any others that I missed, Carl?
No, well, there was one about when you were talking about the gender differences, if there's any information around non-binary or trans youth.
Great question. If you're in the mood to do some grant writing, huge unknown. I can't, I have, in terms of, it hasn't presented a lot in my personal experience. I've been doing this a long time. It has presented, particularly with, I have seen histories with more gay individuals, and again, more historically, where prior to our current, well, again, we're in a complicated time right now. So if we, back up 4 years to the last maybe 12 years, where we saw, particularly in New York State, a real insurgence, more of acceptance of integration, common terminology, pronouns, legalization of same-sex marriage, come a long way, baby. I've seen improvement there, but prior to that, where we were really dealing with a lot more, rejection, identity issues, lack of acceptance, I was seeing some more presentation then. It seems to be a dip down for me. I'm very worried, given some of the new trends in the United States, maybe less so in New York State, knock on wood. Don't have a good answer for you. I don't have enough data. I haven't seen enough research that's emerged yet, but I think it's a very good question.
Yeah, somebody's also asking about any other demographic trends like rural versus urban and those sorts of things. But before we go there, I just wanted to let everyone know that you were I love that you brought up Bessel van der Kolk's diagnosis he's been working on for a while. It's developmental trauma disorder.
Thank you. I knew I was close.
Sure.
Yeah.
But any other demographic trends some Janira is asking?
Yeah, well, normally when I have more time, I do a little bit more about demographics and presentation in urban versus suburban and rural. Happens everywhere. Um, and levels of frequency, we do see some higher levels of frequency in more urban settings for the obvious reasons, more dense housing, a lot of times more poorer housing. And so when there is misuse of fire, there tends to be, higher identification. But, clearly we see wildland fires and, very prevalent in our country for lots of reasons, and youth involvement of those very, very significant. More see it across the United States, particularly in the West. And so in the rural areas, we tend to see the presentations and the behaviors tend to be more outdoor and urban, and I'm sorry, rural wildland fires. The other demographic trends in terms of age, younger children tend to set more fires within their own residence, older children away from their residence. Some of that might be developmental. Maybe a message. We'll talk in a few moments about the characteristics of fire and where they're set and how. But it happens across the board in terms of rural, suburban, and rural. In some ways, there's some different mitigating factors in more rural communities because the use of fire becomes more important. Wood stoves. So there may be some, we talked earlier on when we started about premature assignment of responsibility. So there you actually might have a younger child having some responsibility about putting a log on the fire or maintaining this, but it's done because it's so part of their survival and done with such good care and teaching and modeling and awareness that we see those children's, somewhat able to better manage those. But when that's done more poorly, then again, there's this mismodeling and permission, and then we see incidents go up.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
One other demographic that you're thinking about in terms of socioeconomic status, this happen, we do see higher levels of identification among poor socioeconomic status, and again, probably because of higher levels of chronicity and in early intervention, poor housing density. When we start talking about the cry for help dynamic, though, in neglect and abuse, the distinction between socioeconomic status goes away entirely. It is not, and and that's something to be mindful in terms of presentations, because I've had presentations when very wealthy high-end families that present incredibly beautifully, and it's the concerned parent and check all the boxes and say all the right things, but they play euchre every Thursday night, and Uncle Joey comes over to take care of the child, and little do we know that Uncle Joey is abusing, and we're clueless. So it's again, we have to be. I mentioned the investigator who originally got me involved in this field. He has unfortunately since passed away, but his name was Jerry Bills, and he was an incredible mentor of mine and became a dear friend and very knowledgeable guy. And he used to tease me all the time. You mental health people, you think everybody tells the truth, and he taught me to be an investigator in ways and to kind of be more mindful and to question. And I do think that's something we do need to be mindful of in our field in mental health in this population. You don't know you got what you got until you know you got what you got. We good? I did see one question here. Could these behaviors also be on burning self-harm? Yes, it's a minority of it, but yes, it does show. I guess I think you did share in my introduction, Kara, that I'm in my spare time, I'm the executive director of the Finger Lakes Regional Burn Association. I've become very immersed in the burn community over the last 20 years. It's also become a unique passion, and a lot of my clients and people were involved in fire misuse where they were injured in it and burned, and some intentionally. Okay. All right. Get back to my slides here. So let me shift gears here, and again, we can double back as we need to. Where are we here? I'm about 40 minutes out, so I'm gonna hustle a bit and hope that I can, can do justice to you here. So we now have a foundation of who are these kids, why they do it. Now, how are we going to kind of, determine and do some assessment and, predict treatment protocols. So I'm going to go through this somewhat quickly. You don't have to go back to algebra class. This is not as complicated as it may first look on your screen. But this is, I think, a really good way, as it says on the slide, it's a good conceptual framework to explain, fire setting behavior and a way to categorize it. And really becomes the basis of most of the research and evaluations we've done. It really is the basis of my own personal intake. I replicate this, fairly comprehensively in my own work, and I'll try to talk about that as we go through it. So this is an old friend and colleague of mine who, hasn't been as prevalent in the field. I haven't actually talked with him in a while, but Dr. Ken Feynman has been in the field since the 70s, psychologist out of Huntington Beach, California, and really been one of the founding, fathers of the current, approaches to youth fire setting intervention protocols. And this is really a lot of his work, which again, I think is borne out from a lot of research and replication, and in my opinion, what has withstood the test of time. Ken worked with the Los Angeles Fire Department and started at about the same time I did with the Rochester Fire Department. We were unknown to each other initially and came into the field very much the same way. When Jerry Bills came to the hospital, Captain Joe Day of the Los Angeles Fire Department came to Dr. Feynman and asked for help in the same way. So this is a lot of the evolution of Dr. Feynman's work. So let me, kind of dive into this. The graphic there is just really kind of more of a graphic depiction of this, but I'm going to kind of hopefully make it make sense. So that's Fs equals, G1 plus G2 plus E, where E equals that whole string you see on the bottom. So let's kind of inch through that for a few moments. So, and again, this becomes kind of the basis of my intake. It will sound very familiar, I'm sure, to the majority of you, because it's going to be very similar to your own intake models in terms of the things you collect and want to know. But this one now becomes more specific to fire and begins to then distinguish these differences from our more traditional presentations. So G1 equals this fancy term here, dynamic historical factors predisposing towards maladaptive and antisocial behaviors. So what does that really mean? Well, here's our family history. This is our psychosocial history. This is these opportunities when we're looking at the whole big picture in presentation of this individual in this family. So what do we understand about this family, this individual, in terms of his personality qualities and characteristics, his self-esteem, his skills, his educational background, any presenting diagnoses, learning disabilities. What about his family? What are the structural characteristics there? Is it an intact family, a divorced family, a blended family? What other support systems are there? What are the characteristics? All the things we've been talking about above are basically, what we're looking to kind of pull together here and see what kind of, jumps out as some highlights. So, and then G2 equals historical and current environmental factors that have taught and reinforced fire setting as acceptable behavior. So this is where we depart from our traditional intakes. This is where I spend a lot of time with families, really asking a lot of very specific questions about, well, standard stuff. Do you ever talk about fire safety in your family and your household? How? Do you have smoke alarms? Have you ever practiced a fire safety exit drill in your home? What are your rules? Do you have rules for your children and your family about, what's okay, what's not okay? I mean, explicit rules. I know, again, I grew up in this, industry, and so, my kids suffered from this. My son mad at me to this day that I wouldn't let him play with sparklers at a picnic when he was 7 years old, even though other parents let their children do it, because I didn't want that, risk to be approved. Because unfortunately, I know that those things burn at 1,000 degrees, and I am well aware of the fire injuries and burn injuries that happen there. And again, the statement of permission that you can handle this. So, maybe I go a little far on the continuum, but I'm looking to explore those things in this family versus not having any discussion about it at all. Looking at, very subtle behaviors. So, do they have a fire pit? What are the rules around that? What do they let the kid do, not do? So it's, I'm looking for messaging and modeling, or even birthday parties. And, again, I'm not anti-birthday party and I'm not anti-birthday cake with candles, but there's a message in it. So it's, so here it is. It's the kid's birthday and families come together and there's the parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles, and it's, birthday number one. And it's a big, to do. And then there's a nice dinner and gathering, and out comes the birthday cake with the candle. And then we set it down right in front of their face. And then we sing them a song, and then we teach them to blow. And, and then we applaud. And so right there is a very subtle message, from very early childhood, that we are teaching fire is fragile and you can control it and you make it go away in the wisp of a breath. So how do we begin to kind of change that? I'm not saying we don't celebrate birthdays, but there's a sense of caution in it. So we don't put the cake right in front of them. And if they lean forward, we kind of subtly kind of hold them back. Not too close, honey. Be back a little bit. And then maybe, when they're very, very young, we're going to help, and keep some distance from their breath. But there's a subtle message of safety and care and caution that's introduced. We do that in other things. We don't just, when our kids become 16 in New York, we don't just, throw them the car keys. There's a whole process that we go through. And even then, when they pass their driver's test, we don't throw them the key and go, hey, see ya, have a good time. It's usually, we hold on to the key a little bit more diligently before they rip it out of our grasp, and we give them the lecture about responsibility and care and et cetera. So I'm looking for those messaging in how the physical environment treats fire. E is this whole now string of things. The immediate environmental contingency that encourage fire-setting behavior, circumstances before, during, and after the fire. So we'll go through these piece by piece. So let's start with C. So one of the things I'm always looking for is there some precedent, is there some trigger, is there some occurrence just prior or in proximity to the fire that would explain this behavior. So I mentioned the young woman before who all of a sudden there was the birth of a new sibling, a pretty major shift in family dynamic. I'll share some others as we continue to talk about this. One of the other things we know about crisis or trauma is, is that it tends to lower stress tolerance and increase impulsivity. So the whole trauma response will become more dysregulated and then become perhaps more impulsive. I know even for myself, if I have a disappointment or a bad morning or things don't go as well as I hoped for the client, or I call home and my wife criticizes me for something I forgot to do. And, so I might be, a little off my game or a little grumpy, and then I go out to lunch, and then there's the dessert menu, so again, I'm in a little bit of an unsettled state, and in my better moments, I'm gonna, no, thanks, I'm good. And, I need cheesecake. I need, I need to treat myself. I need to feel good. So I think it's the same kind of dynamic with the permission, the sense of lower, kind of, wherewithal that then will kind of be an impetus to misuse fire. So we're looking for some kind of crisis or trauma. either an immediate precedent or in the recent past. And uh, hopefully that's clear. The other thing where I think we need to be much more involved in understanding here as mental health professionals is we need to understand the dynamics of the fire misuse. So it's really going into some depth about the characteristics of the fire start. You know, what time of day, where was it? Were they alone? Were they with others? Those are all distinguishing demographics and characteristics. You were mentioning some of the other demographics before. Uh, when we see the conduct disorder I mentioned earlier, though many of those that fire misbehavior tends to be in group and with others and not at home. If I have a well, I'll give you a couple of different examples that might extinguish, or I'm sorry, distinguish the intent here. Because all the thing along with this, I'm also listening for what was the response to the fire and what did they do about it, if anything. So we talked before about curiosity. So here's a quick example of a young man who was upstairs and going in his parents' bedroom, as many young children do. Mom was downstairs, so momentary lapses in supervision, finds a lighter on his mother's dresser, is intrigued by it, grabs it, runs into his own bedroom, starts to experiment with it, play with it. He's sitting on the floor next to his bed. He's got the lighter going. It's near the bed ruffle, and lo and behold, the bed ruffle ignites. He panics. He's going, oh my God. He quickly runs to the bathroom to get a cup of water. We talked earlier about the misunderstanding of fire, what most people, including adults, don't appreciate, that fire basically doubles in size about every 30 to 60 seconds. And so he runs to the bathroom, comes back with a 3-ounce cup, of water, and the fire is now grown, and that's going to be a meaningless effort. At this point, he's really very panicked and remorseful, runs downstairs, screams for his mommy, and tells her what's going on. Clearly she's upset, frightened. They get out of the house. They do call 911. Fire department does come. They do respond. They are able to minimize damage. There is some damage. Mom is upset. What were you thinking? My God, what were you? And she's mad, but he's crying and he's scared and he's upset. And he goes, I didn't mean, I didn't know. And so you're seeing remorse. And so here's that formula. Here's the child. The child, tried to do something about it. He tried to, ameliorate it. And he told his parent the lighter was readily available in the environment. So all those things are going to reinforce to me that this is primarily curiosity motivated, no further intervention needed here. Okay, let's fast forward to sexual abuse case. Young woman, 11-ish. We have a fire that was started in her parents' bedroom. The fire was started also with a lighter. It was igniting a pile of laundry, particularly stepfather's laundry, on the middle of the bed. No effort to tell anybody about the fire or respond to it in any way. So, there is a question of, what is burned? Does that tell us something? It might. It's not, you can't always go to the bank to it, but the fact that this was stepfather's clothing in the middle of a bed should cause us to go, is something going on here? Is this some indication of sexual abuse? In this case, it was. It's not always the case, but what was burned and where at least should alert us to some tipping in that direction. Was there an accelerant? What was the likelihood that it would be discovered? What was the likelihood that someone else might be harmed? Like little Charlie, the school 9 fire. In his mind, he was being careful. He didn't want to hurt people. That's why I did it downstairs with everybody was upstairs, you know, versus a deliberate intent to, I'll show you, or I'm gonna fix this once and for all. The other thing we're looking to understand here is what are the thoughts and emotional states before, during, and after the fire. So here I'm looking to to ask. I'm trying to think of some good examples here. So I was going to use this example in a few minutes. Um, let me come back to this. I want to give you a more clear example in about 2 minutes here. And but we're looking to look at the literally thought distortion. So what's the thinking patterns prior to the fire that might encourage and rationalize the behavior? What's the thought pattern during it? And then what's the thinking after? And then equally and simultaneously, what are the emotional or feeling states in those places? And walking through so that you understand that as a therapist, but equally and more important is that in our therapy and our interventions, that they begin to understand that, because it's in there we have the power of some intervention. The other thing we're looking for is what are the external, what are the reinforcers? What's encouraging and continuing this this behavior to continue? So is it an external reinforcer, such as, we got a group of boys on a nice spring day in middle school, and one of them's got a lighter, and they go into the boys' bathroom, and one of them gets the idea of, let's start the toilet paper on fire, and the alarms will go off and we'll get out of school. And it's, oh no, we can't do that. No, no, you do it, do it, do it. And there's all the peer pressure and the encouragement. And so, this kid decides to go for it. Well, what's the reinforcing there? Well, he's cool. He's getting peer acceptance. So there's, simple kind of a external reinforcement. There's a sense of power there as well. Is there an internal reinforcer there? Is there a sense of power and and one of the things we're looking for here is how internalized is that? And we'll talk again in a few moments a little bit more about this, but are they able to describe a sense of, it creates a sense of emotional regulation, a sense of calm, a sense of disrupts the sense of depression. So those are the ones we want to be a little bit more in higher alert for, because those are the ones that are more difficult to intervene and to redirect. So it's trying to get a better handle on this. This is a form here. Hopefully it's clear that Dr. Feynman developed some years ago, but it's I keep in my repertoire because it helps kind of guide me and evaluate some of these things. So you see on the top here, there's some examples of some of the internal reinforcements. So does it increase the sense of excitement and exhilaration? These might be kids who are adrenaline junkies, maybe some of those ADHD kids we talked about who are looking for engagement and a sense of connection. Does it create a sense of happiness, calm, power? Sexual excitement in the earlier literature was one that was presented. I can't say it's non-existent, but once again, I probably can count on one or two hands the number of times that's actually ever presented. The spiritual elation is, again, those are sometimes more cultish presentations. We've heard it. It's unusual, but there. Guilt, burning, again, getting rid of evidence or things we're not proud of, something I stole, getting rid of it, we're going to maybe kind of bring that sense of, and then on the other side, decreasing depression, grief. I think fairly obvious in terms of the external ones, peer attention, parent attention, positive or negative, esteem. Money happens, it's rare, but it's out there. We've had drug dealers hire a 14-year-old, gave him $100 to start in a fire in a abandoned house where we knew there was a drug task force set up. So he was encouraged to do it. We had a landlord, use kids to, get some insurance money and pay them. Again, not typical, but it's out there. Hopefully that's kind of clear. So that's kind of the organization of the intake and the things we want to begin to learn. So let's now kind of use the end of our time here quickly to kind of go through some of these things. And I'm looking at the clock and I'm going to start to talk a little faster. But any questions at that point? Again, I'm having trouble seeing. I got to move down on my chat here. All right, yes, okay. Um, So what are the expected treatments? So what are the differences here? I'm going to kind of go through some of this fairly quickly and I'll highlight some of the other things. So difference between fire saving behavior and nutritional care. So the good news here is that all of you who are clinicians and in the mental health field and have had some level of core experience, you've got all the fundamental tools you need to work with the majority of this population. So I hope you walk out of this afternoon with some empowerment. You're hearing about some of the differences. And so some of the differences are more thorough and more careful assessment. The other is better collaboration with information sharing with others. You heard me reference my work with the fire service, with social services and child protectives. Those are things where we don't want to, this is a place we don't want to be alone so much. And we want to make sure we dot our I's, cover our T's. We deal with the fire behavior very directly and the interventions. So I think this slide kind of talks about that. I'm going to take less time on this and get to some of the treatment protocols. So it's maintaining a collaborative relationship. My own bias here is it takes a more flexible approach than some of the more traditional medical models of clinical interventions. I often see myself in a case management role as well as the primary provider. And as I've already said a few times now, I have a better relationship and relations with other key resources and agencies that are partnering with me with this child. It's doing your homework very carefully in terms of, testing, structured assessments, the back inventories, looking at, the primary presentations we talked about in terms of depression, anxiety, et cetera. More comprehensive family interventions, parenting styles, again, the things we talked about in that G2 assessment protocol in the formula. One of my own protocols, and again, you probably all have your own, but I like this. I'm addicted to genograms, and this is a standard routine in all my intakes. It allows me to get a lot of information pretty quickly, understand family dynamics, family history. I often, when I first meet with a family where they're involved with fire setting behavior, we'll meet with the whole family, introduce myself, kind of the protocols here. And then I'll do this genogram. We'll collect family data together. And it's kind of interesting. It's kind of fun. Very often the family and the kids will hear some things about their family they never heard before, or their great grandparent who came from some foreign country. And so there's it helps with rapport building and engagement. I used to have a whiteboard in my own office. A lot of times I'll use newsprint, and now I'll do it on my iPad with a larger screen, and we'll kind of watch it happen in real time. One quick story is I had a really very disruptive family. There were multiple marriages, his kids, her kids, our kids, and a lot of dynamics where the child felt pretty marginalized. And and I'm erasing and fixing. No, I was married to them first, and then this, and this is not the example of that one. But we got to the end of it, and we all kind of took this pause and stepped back. And then we looked at this drawing, and the father just spontaneously looked at it and remarked in front of the whole family, "Wow, no wonder we're so fucked up." And then there was this, this kind of spontaneous laughter, this sense of, wow, we've been through a lot. So I find it as a very useful tool. The hierarchy of the standard of care remains the same. I'm not gonna. I think you can make your own assumptions here in terms of your experience, but we can be accessible, I think, in the majority of cases. with outpatient, clinical treatment. This is a list of the treatment protocols. I'm going to, whip through again some of the things we want to highlight in terms of differences in protocols and some of the tools and make sure we get to them. So let me just go right there. So the initial interventions is once I start to meet with the family, one of the things that we're going to prioritize with these families is safety. So we're going to go through household rules and changes around supervision and access. We may even, talk about locking up materials and assisting parents with supervision and protocols. If we have a more serious case that we can't get to the place of where the kid actually threatened to start a fire, there was lots of alienation and anger towards the parent because of neglect issues. And, you wait till you go to bed tonight, I'm going to burn this house down. Well, and there's real fear about that. Well, what happens in a residential treatment facility? Well, we have 24-hour staff. We have more intensive supervision, access, and control of the environment. Well, where can we mimic that in a household? So again, I've arranged this with families where we might go on, kind of different, sleep shifts, motion detectors on handles, cameras, getting other people to stay over. So it's kind of structuring those situations or creating other situations where there's more supervision and oversight. So being mindful of those kind of things. I'll work with a lot of the families, we'll talk very clearly about, this is a process. And we're not going to fix it in 1 or 2 sessions, but we need to set up safety protocols and agreements. So I will, work with kids and families to have actual behavioral contracts about, putting things away, not using or touching, giving permission for access. I'm going to search your backpack and your pockets and your bedroom routinely. And we're going to understand that that's going to be the understanding. We're going to limit certain behaviors and access. So it's moving into that. One of the things we've learned that's critical in the longer term, whether it's curiosity or it's not curiosity, is that a comprehensive educational intervention needs to be performed. Now, this can be done in tandem if you have a youth fire center program in your community. It's partnering with the fire service because they're more skilled with it. You can also, I help develop these protocols. I happen to be able to do this, more so on my own. But then we can also then partner with other agencies that we can help you to set up with. But it can't be, a loose or a casual intervention. It's a more, comprehensive one. There are models around the country where you actually team. In Pittsburgh, in the hospital program, the clinical staff actually does joint group interventions with the Pittsburgh Fire Department. So there's different ways to model it, but it's really kind of going through. Remember, we talked about the baseline here is almost all of these kids have a chronic misunderstanding of fire. So we want to inform that better. And this comes from onto some of the developmental studies about what some of the chronic misunderstanding is. The smallest children, don't understand developmentally that a match can burn a house because they don't understand that something very small can burn something very big. So it's kind of, where do we talk about that? We talk about the things they can control, they can't control, the speed of fire, what burns, what doesn't burn. They really don't know that. They understand, even kindergarten can tell you a piece of paper will burn. But if we start making it more complicated, I say, well, how about your teddy bear? Blank. So I'm not going to put you guys in charge of that, but just to be mindful that this is what a comprehensive educational, educational intervention looks at. The timing of it might change. We might, if it's a more severe, more angry, more acting out person who isn't ready for this, we might delay this to a later time in the treatment protocol, but it needs to be part of the protocol. And again, the parents involved in this. So here's another one that I wanted to make sure we had time to talk about. This is the Bumpus graphic technique. So remember we talked about the D1, D2, D3 and the feeling states before. This is a tool that's well evaluated. It's been used with young children to young adolescents. And the goal of this tool is to help them to really understand and help them connect their thinking and emotional responses to the triggers that then leads to the choice to start a fire. And it's making it very concrete and connecting it and then developing alternative behaviors. So this is done very early on. It's a good way to get some rapid control. It helps to correlate, the triggers, the stress and feelings. It's actually concrete, so it's very good with younger children. It's actually a graphic depiction. And so one of the ways to start it, and I'll do that, is, I'll try to engage the kids. Do you have any motivation to kind of change this and not do this anymore? And I might have to tease it. I might have to come up with a good, reason. It might be, well, I don't want to lose my screen time anymore, or my phone always gets, taken away, or I don't want to get in trouble, or whatever it is. I want to find some motivating piece that they can engage and try to buy into this behavior. And then what I do is we set up a physical graph. So here's a quick depiction. So it's an XY axis where along the x-axis is time and feeling states, and along the y-axis is the intensity of emotion. So I'm gonna give you walk through a very quick one very quickly, which also gives us some illustration of those, D1 and D2 states. So I had a young man I worked with who started a fire on outside his house. He was 13, so the day started out with some excitement. He got up that morning and things were normal, but he had a deal with his mom. He was going to be able to go to the music store and be able to get some music he really loved, but he had to do some chores and cut the grass first. So he got breakfast. He did mow the lawn, but there were some issues with that. So I'm going to start out. Let's pretend we have a slide time machine. We're going to start out that day. What time did you get up that day? 8 o'clock. How are you feeling when you first got up? Tired. How tired? And then we draw the line. All right, what was the thing? What was next? Well, I was hungry. And I ate breakfast. How hungry? Oh, really hungry. Well, what'd you do next? Watch some TV while I ate breakfast. How did it feel to do that? Comforting, engaging. Then, what I had to do. Well, my mom reminded me I had to, cut the grass before we went to the music store. How'd you feel that? Well, a little bit annoyed, but I really want to go to the music store. And then, well, what'd you do? I was, cutting the grass. How'd you feel about that? Well, somewhat annoyed and irritated and, impatient. We rate that. And then, well, but I got it done. How'd you feel then? Well, satisfied. And then what happened? Well, my mom looked out the window and she started screaming at me because she felt I missed a lot of the yard and my lines weren't straight. And she told me that the music store was off the table. What did you do? And I was enraged. Well, how enraged? And what'd you do then? She told me to go to my room. Well, what'd you do then? I went to my room, and what'd you think? Well, I thought about it. I'll show you. And this is we had. I'm going to start a fire. So he starts thinking of these things he's going to do to get back at his mom. He's feeling, what was the feeling state of that? Power, sense of revenge, and going to, well, what did you do? Well, I ran toilet paper out the window and I started, setting it on fire, and some of the eaves started to catch on fire. How'd you feel then? I was exhilarated. And again, I'm rushing through this, but I think you're going to get some idea of this. And there was a reference here that we can look through this. And then then what'd you do? Well, I just ran out downstairs and ran out of the house. And how'd you feel then? And so there was this sense of empowerment, and mom's now discovering, told his mom, and she's discovering it, and she's now beside herself, and I'm going to call the police. And, so he's feeling this sense of incredible satisfaction, and I show you, and I don't care. And then we talked about some of the thinking mistakes in that, and so on. So it really kind of helps them go minute by minute in terms of the trends and the emotional and thinking states and how they change through the process. And then we can begin to contract. And so we start to do some problem solving. And as we said before, these are families who are in chaos. They don't always, have good tools for doing this. So we're going to teach them, and teach the individual what are some things we can do instead, and really brainstorm and kind of allow them to kind of come up with some realistic ideas, and that may engage parents in allowing that. So it might even be in terms of emotional re-regulation, that it might mean allowing them to go out into the driveway and throw a basketball, even though they think it might be rewarding some negative behaviors. But it's negotiating for some control and things of that. So the Bumpus technique is a unique tool, and it's been used in this population very successfully for a long time. I'm going to kind of go through a few more very quickly. I think my sense is that these are tools that you're using with families, but I just want to highlight the importance importance of these families in terms of addressing fire misbehavior and expressing environmental dynamics and ways to teach about better responsibility and engaging them as a family and as an individual. Clearly, behavior management, these are kids and parents that don't know how to level punishment and intervention. So I think they need a lot of help with that and working with that with the parent directly. That may be more parental and family systems, but engaging the kids through those things as well in terms of family contracting. This is a unique tool. The Gardner storytelling is really quickly. It's we'll use this with trying to engage kids with having them tell a story about something they love to do. So maybe if they're involved in a sport or a little league and they're imagining being a star pitcher, well, then we take their story and we redefine it. Where I worked with another young person who started a fire, and what happened though? This time they actually burned their hands and their fingers, and they really were some serious burn injuries that they couldn't throw the ball the way that they wanted to. And so it was a really sad outcome. And so it's kind of allowing them to understand consequences without, kind of this scare tactic and, what's going to happen to you. Covert sensitization is, kind of trying to link some negative outcome to an urge feeling that helps them to extinguish some of the urging. Clearly, self-regulation skills. There's a lot of apps. Don't really have time to get through some of these. Cognitive behavioral skills in terms of thinking errors. I wanted this kind of anger management. These are things you know. But here's the last one I want to focus on. And I only have a couple minutes here. When I started in this field, I didn't like involving law enforcement with my kids. I thought I was supposed to keep them separate. But I really learned that accountability is a really integral part of this and becomes a more important. And a lot of the the Abraxas program uses accountability. And then we've really started to use the juvenile justice and restorative justice as a way to get kids to be accountable and to then work within the community. And I'm not sure if you're going to get a copy of these slides. I hope you can. But real quickly, there was a case example here that I was involved with some adolescent boys that started burn swastikas into the road in front of some homes in a neighborhood that was primarily Jewish. And it was the night before the Holocaust Memorial Day. And the whole town was unsettled. They didn't know who did it. They thought it was a hate crime and an outside agency. There was a Holocaust survivor that lived there. It was really incredibly disruptive. The school was unsettled. The police, the fire chief, and there was involvement. And they wanted to initially hang these kids, but they did ultimately come to me. And we did bring in a restorative justice and what was called a community impact process. So this assumes that the victims are in agreement, but part of the community impact is that they had to interview people who were uniquely victimized by their behavior. We actually had one of the kids actually interview one of the Holocaust survivors and sit in their living room and tell their story and how this affected them and how their behavior impacted them. One of them had to interview one of their parents. One of them actually interviewed the fire chief, who was also involved with some other hate crime issues and was concerned what was unfolding. And it was incredibly powerful and allowed us to steer it away from a more intensive criminal intervention to one that was much more productive, rehabilitative, and move on. You can see in the slide here, this was after the fact where, this was the woman, it was in the newspapers. I was so blown away, we all were. It was really transforming for everybody. It was so powerful because it brought the boys to the understanding of how there were really serious consequences for something that they thought was an innocuous prank. those 3 kids will never be the same. They will think about the way they act. For all the money we would spend on the judicial system, it wouldn't have accomplished that. So it's integrating those things. And again, you've been hearing me through the afternoon talk about how it's important we don't work alone, and that we do, it's primarily law enforcement, fire service, social service agencies, schools, where we can, some under memorandum of understanding to really kind of bring those services and the ability to communicate together. There are some national organizations. Y-Fires is Y-Fires, I believe it's .org. It's right there on the screen that will give you some references and some models here. Again, I want to be here for you, can talk about some of these in more depth. I have a lot of experience in New York State. New York, we were at the top of the game for many years. Honestly, we still have some pockets of very good functioning programs. There have been some erosions, but I think we can rebuild. And with all of your help, I hope we can get there. And hopefully this sparks, no pun intended, for some of you to become more engaged with some confidence and move ahead with your own programs or develop new ones. And I think with that, I'm at 2 o'clock. So
Hi, Paul.
thank you.
Yes, I just wanted to see if you had anything else that you'd want to share about treatment. I let people know that you might go over a little bit because this is really important information, but wanted to see if there was anything else around treatment that you feel like you'd want to just expand on any more.
Well, it depends on what people's openness to time is. If they're, I'm going back to this particular slide. I think my hope is that the folks, going back, trying to go back to that,
Mm-hmm.
bear with me 1 second here. Yeah, there we are. Not that one. This one here. So the D1, D2, D3, F1, F2, F3. So the bumpus technique. Maybe we take another minute with that. I think I gave you a pretty good picture of it. I was hoping there would be a little more time to actually walk you through it more, but just so we can come back to what the goal of it is. And so there would be nothing wrong with prompting or guiding. With older kids, they're pretty good at this. With younger kids, it's okay to maybe even have a parent there as a coach, because one of the things we want to help them with is for themselves is to connect. We talked about the cognitive behavioral things. Again, my assumption is that we have a mental health team here who is more adept at the traditional mental health interventions. So CBT skills, emotional regulation, relaxation kind of things. I think we can afford to skip over a lot of those slides. I just want to emphasize that they're probably more relevant in this population because we know those skills are more undermined. But one of the things we do want to do is help the children tie their own decision-making and actions to set or start fires or use fire in a way that they can see where they get escalated or those urges begin to build up. And so they literally can feel it and see it. And so we do want to might have to help them with that a little bit. We know that younger kids developmentally aren't so good with feelings or identifying them or labeling them. So nothing wrong with those old, feelings charts, with the pictures of the faces of happy, sad, so on, and helping them with that and maybe walking them through it and trying to identify them and really breaking it down into the moments of that where things were going okay and then not so going okay. And so kind of helping them to see what might help them that ramp up is, and that, here was that one young man I just talked about where we knew there were some baseline levels of conflict and animosity between this young man and his mom that were ongoing. And it didn't take a lot to really kind of get this over, tip it over, and the mom was incredibly critical and judgmental and punishing. And so when she's going after him about the lawn and, you're always running, you never do anything, you don't give a shit about anything, and look out there, look at that lawn, you call that a good job. And, and so, just how critical she is. So we really brought that to a very real kind of moment in time where then he could then touch his emotion, thoughts and emotions. So, you can kind of break down the sequencing and, stall at different moments of it to accent those. And then bringing in the real cognitive behavioral, kind of connections in that and how your thought then connects to that feeling. And then that feeling, creates to your body and your sensation, and then to a behavior and a choice of an action. So that's where I would have wanted to take a little more time in that. But we're drawing, we're drawing the sequence of the day in very real time. And then, tying to that what the thought and the intensity of the emotion was.
Mhm. Great. Somebody asked, this could be our one question we get to. Could you say a little bit about finding treatment targets in any given individual and family?
Treatment target. So where do one of these things get more prioritized?
Mm,
Is that it?
I think
Yeah,
so.
yes. So, when we do this kind of intake, and if I'm finding, that maybe the primary kind of triggers or, kind of things in this kid are really much more reactive to the parental, like I said, being a much more punishing, punitive. These are parents who do, might be a bit, coming from abuse situations themselves, don't know how to regulate, maybe come from more punishing backgrounds, I had a father quote literally in our assessment and intake, well, my dad beat me when I was young and I learned, and and I turned out okay. At which point I had to bite my tongue, because here he was doing the exact same thing. And so he really believed, spare the rod, spare the child. And so, so right away that now tells me about his own emotional regulation, his dynamics about anger, his misinformation of how to effectively discipline or, guide his child, and really was helpless about it. I mean, he really didn't. I mean, he believed what he believed. That's what he was exposed to. And it took some effort, so my emphasis there was I did less work with the kid in that particular family. So there I know to turn up, the kind of, anger dynamics, behavior management, giving them tools, skills, contracting, family meetings about coming up with consensual and mutual things that kids are going to buy into. That takes, in some of these families, and that takes some good salesmanship, because they don't always buy in. But that's where I use myself and that whole relationship building, and try to then tap into the, particularly the father's experience in this and his own growing up. And, oh yeah, so your father beat the shit out of you. You tell me you kind of worked all right, but would you kind of give me a moment to, would it be okay if we really talk about that? And what some of the things that maybe really weren't so okay in that? What was the ongoing relationship with your father? In terms of your own resentment or fear. Is that what you want for this kid and you? What do you fantasize about down the road, about going to a ball game together, or you're gonna go get a beer and you're gonna be buddies. And but if this kid, believes that if he missteps or says the wrong thing in front of you, he's gonna get the shit kicked out of him. What do you think that's gonna do to that relationship down the road? So I'm giving you a real example. That's the way I talk. That's me. And it's, oh my God, well, no, I don't want that.
Mhm.
So you have some choices here. I said, give me a shot here. Let's experiment. Can we try these things? And then I can bring the kid back in, and I can share that, hey, your dad and I had a really cool conversation. And he is worried about you. He wants you to do the right thing. But sometimes, we want our kids to do everything. We don't always handle it the best way we can because it's out of our own frustration or fear. But he's gonna, he's gonna come along here. He's gonna work with us. We're gonna work together to maybe change some things. So we set up some hopes and some future here. But it's very skill based. And so so I hope that answers the question of it. So that's going to guide me there.
Mhm. Yep.
Uh,
And then the 7-step process.
yes, yes. Yeah,
like
so
that.
it's engaging them not only in what are their options, but maybe even in terms of disciplinary
Mhm.
option. You know, what can we do to change this behavior? What's the problem with this behavior? And then what are some of the, that's, I think that's a standard frustration for all of us who've had kids, how high do we hang them and what's gonna, what's the degree of, I always talk about this again, when I have more privilege and more time and day, I take more time in this because, I always talk about discipline versus punishment. So the goal of punishment is to inflict pain. The goal of discipline is to teach, to change behavior.
Yep.
And that's where the restorative justice piece comes in too. Because, and there were, and that, so giving me another minute here in terms of changing where we're going with this, the justice system and the legal system has been complicated in this arena. We do know that fire setting behavior has a lot of stigma, a lot of fear, and we don't want to label kids with that because the juvenile justice system and other systems don't really know what to do. And there's this fear, and it's lock them up, get them away. And that's really serious information. We know there's foundational research on when we drive younger people into the adult criminal system, they actually come back and reoffend more severely and more quickly. So here again is where do we kind of then up the ante of coming up with interventions that I think are therapeutic interventions that would help us to develop more confidence with youth, give them more insight and accountability. So that would be the other place where, but that takes some community engagement and working with the juvenile justice system. And we, like with youth fire center programs around the country, they ebb and flow. It's been a frustration of mine my whole career. There are times, man, we're just on the top of the mountain, and other times we're starting from scratch. Unfortunately, that's our reality.
Yeah.
I don't know where we are in terms of pushing the boulder up the hill right
Mhm.
now. I hope we're moving. There are some upswings in terms of on the national level. There is going to be the first international conference on youth and adult fire misuse in May
Oh, great.
In Worcester, Massachusetts. That's going to bring a lot of us from around the world together.
Great. Great.
Let me inform you of that.
Okay. We're going to wrap up. If you could just move to the end really quickly. Thank you all who stayed on with us. I wanted to just get a little more, some treatment information to you all.
Yeah,
Um,
and again, I apologize for the rush at the end. That was my fear. But again, I'm here. I'm more than open to follow-ups or outreach in any way that it will be helpful.
mhm.
Is that where I
And
want to be?
the
Or-
next, yep.
Okay,
So on December 4th, we have an event, cross networking and resource gathering for youth peer advocates, strengthening ties, supporting caregivers and developing their natural supports on December 16th. So hope you join us for those and anything else in the future. We're going to be releasing our CTAC annual survey today. So please complete that if you can, because we do listen to your interests and your needs, and we want to attend to what you all need. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Paul, for all of your work and all of your wisdom and sharing that with us. It was incredibly insightful, incredibly helpful. And everybody, we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Take
thank
care,
you.
everyone.
All right.
Okay, bye-bye.